I'll record at the cloud. Okay. Okay.
Okay. So let me get to the bigger screen so we can. Okay, here's what we're doing today. This Colorado's electoral mechanics and structure, especially in relation to voting methods. This is a 3-session presentation. We're not going to go into a lot of the details on what happened in the first 2 sessions, but they are in our archives, in our meeting records, so you can go back and see those. We'd like to all start on the same page with the same background and knowledge. Unfortunately, anytime you want to implement a voting method, you have to think about how it's going to be implemented. If you're doing this in a club, it's easy. Everybody's going to be friendly. Everybody's going to help you out, make it work. If you're doing this for a governmental election, there are going to be people who are going to ask a lot of questions, which is good, but you really want to have all your ducks in a row before you start doing this. So sometimes I think I talk about voting methods and it sounds like I'm sourpuss, but I just want them to succeed, and I want everybody to work to make them succeed. I am a strong believer in better voting methods, and but I also see many ways for implementation or adoption to fail, and so I want us to. I really want us to pay attention to those things. Okay, so just to review what these different voting methods are: plurality voting, most votes wins. Everybody should be familiar with these. They're either single winner, vote for one, or choose one, it's called, and multi-winner, say you have 3 seats to fill, then you can vote for up to 3. If you have 5 seats to fill, then you can vote for up to 5. Approval voting is the simplest, better voting method to implement. Voting machines can already do it. In this, suppose you have one person to elect, but you don't have to just choose one. You can choose 3 candidates you like. You can choose 4 candidates you like. You have many, you can say much more with your ballot in a very simple way. So I'm going to move on now to the next one, unless somebody has questions about approval voting. This is meant to be review, so I wasn't going to talk at length about any of these, but I do want to show the ballots.
Was there a
Celeste,
slide?
your slides aren't moving forward.
Yeah.
That's let me stop sharing and then go back and share again. And I think I probably need to share a web page or something. Let's see. What page are you seeing right now?
Approval ballot, approval voting ballot.
What are you seeing right now?
Plurality voting.
Good. Now it's working. Okay, good. Okay, and this was seen, I talked a lot during this one, but I said everything on this page, I think so. Okay, plurality voting. I hope that looks familiar. Approval voting, you can vote for more than the number of candidates to be elected. And you just add up all the votes, and whoever gets the most votes wins. That's a single winner. And then multi-winner, there are a couple different versions. We're not going to talk about those right now. A star voting ballot is probably the most expressive of the ones that I'm going to talk about. Expressive in terms of what you can say when you mark the ballot, and expressive in the information that is retrieved from the ballot. So you get to score every candidate. So from 0, which is no support, to 5, which is maximum support. You can also have a tie if you like 2 candidates equally. The general strategy here is give your favorite the maximum support, give your least favorite the minimum support, and then the other candidates you give some score in between. The top two scorers, you add up all the scores, the top two scorers go on to a head-to-head runoff. In this case, if the top two scorers were Alba and Bill, Alba would get the vote on this ballot because Alba has a higher score than Bill. If the top two scorers were Bill and Cora, then Bill would get the vote on this ballot because Bill has a higher score than Cora. If Bill and Doe were made the final runoff or the top two scores, then this voter would sit out the runoff because they have the same score for both Bill and Doe. So it encourages you to differentiate between the candidates. Okay, any questions on star voting, score, then automatic runoff? Okay, ranked voting ballot. Here you rank your candidates in order of preference. So you are not allowed to have ties. You have to pick which one you like first, which one you like second, which one you like. Well, you only have to pick your first choice. You don't have to pick any others. But if you want to pick others, you should pick the second choice, the third choice, the fourth choice. And Jen is going to talk a little bit about what happened in Alaska with some of the ranked voting ballots. Only your first choice is counted in the first round. And it may be that your first choice makes it to the final round. And so people never see your other backup choices. But this is another more expressive way to show your preference. And this is the one that's gained the most traction around the US, particularly the single winner ranked choice voting. We call it instant runoff voting because ranked choice voting can mean lots of different voting methods, tabulation methods. And it was interesting in Erie when I went to the Charter Commission meeting and they were talking about ranked choice voting can mean a lot of different ones. And so should we use the instant runoff version or the proportional single transferable vote? So we're in this group, we tend to use the more specific name. We usually avoid the RCV name. Okay. So we considered a couple questions. We considered what better voting methods have been adopted and used, and what can we learn from those experiences? Basically, historical lessons that we've come across in Colorado. The main idea that we've come across is that municipalities seem to be the easiest targets, especially for instant runoff voting. We now have some enabling legislation, and we will this fall, we think, have some instant runoff elections in a coordinated campaign. It's possible that only one or two people will run for each seat, in which case it won't have it won't have the ranked voting. But if 3 or more people do run, then there will be a ranked voting election, an instant runoff voting election. I'm going to skip some of this other stuff. We should think about legal hurdles. We should think about whether we want to try to institute multiple reforms or not when we're adopting a new voting method. So let's look at what we talked about for question number 2. Which elections should we target? There are lots of different elections out there: municipal, county, regional, state, federal. We could do primary elections or general elections. We could do nonpartisan elections. We could do single winner. We could do multi-winner. We could try to change elections for multi-member bodies to proportional contests. There's a lot of stuff we could do. And I don't know if we came up with the best answer here, but primary elections may be where voting methods can provide the biggest bang for our buck. And I know that the Boulder County League is very interested in looking into primary elections in general, and maybe getting some conclusions based on research on this. Presidential primaries are the big sell, but they only come every 4 years. And we should also research Colorado laws. We're very interested in proportional representation, and the National League's position is in favor of proportional representation. So we need to, we should consider that. And then question number 3, which is what we're going to talk about today. What does using better voting methods look like? When we advocate for a better voting method, we league members should be prepared to describe the voters, the candidates, the election administrators, and the jurisdiction's expected experiences. So this is some advice maybe for Betty and Mary Ann when you're talking about your experience or your presentation to Jeffco. This is what I think is what people want to hear. So far, we've never had a primary election, a general election, or a coordinated election with a better voting method, but that should happen this fall. There's a lot of work happening right now to set up the ballot format, to provide useful reports of election results, and to figure out how to conduct post-election audits. Fortunately, for people who are moving forward with instant runoff voting, a lot of this work is happening with Boulder and Broomfield now, so it should be easier in the future. Approval voting advocates would argue that it's automatic basically for approval voting. Star voting advocates would argue that star voting is the best for the voter's experience, and that it's not that hard to do these other things, but every jurisdiction should look into it themselves. And every voting method has its own strategy for being most effective. We don't like to think about using strategies as league members. We want people to just vote honestly and sincerely, but every voting method, in fact, does have its own strategy, and we can go into that more. And once we think about harder about adopting one, we probably do need to talk about strategies more. So let's talk about the voter experience. You have a better way to express your opinions with a better voting method. Opinions are recorded in different ways: thumbs up, scoring, first choice, backups. We talked about those when we looked at the ballots. The number of rankings or scores may be smaller than the number of candidates, so that's something to consider. You don't, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, there were 26 candidates the year I was studying that election. I actually lived there for almost a month, and I went to a lot of campaign events. I don't think they're now, they had 26 rankings on their ballot. Now they've decided, no, 26 is too many. We're going to limit it to 15. So if they have 15 or more candidates, they limit it to 15, which actually doesn't seem that unreasonable. However, in New York City, they had, I don't know, a dozen candidates. They only let you rank 5, and it ended up that nobody got a majority in the end, because 15% of the people did not get any of their rankings in the last round. None of their 5 rankings made it to the final 2. So maybe New York City needed more than 5 rankings. I haven't looked at the cast vote records, the actual ballot information, to find out. So, but that's something to think about. In terms of voting experience, it's also very important to follow the directions so that your vote is not invalidated. And Jen will talk more about this. Basically, in approval voting, it's impossible to spoil your ballot. Because you can vote for as many candidates as you want. It's possible in any sort of ranked voting method to invalidate your ballot. There are lots of rules, so make sure you follow them. In star voting, you can only give one score to each candidate. So if you give more than one score to a candidate, then that ballot or that candidate's vote will be invalidated. I mentioned strategy before. It's less important in these voting methods, but it does still exist. In New York City, for instance, the head of Fair Vote, which advocates for instant runoff voting and other forms of RCV, wrote an op-ed suggesting that you should rank all the front runners if you wanted to make sure that your vote counted in the final round, which was excellent advice, but maybe not everybody wanted to rank all the front runners. In star voting, one piece of strategy is to give each candidate a different score if there are 6 or fewer candidates to ensure your vote counts in the runoff. Does anybody have questions about this voting experience?
I have a question. This is Gary. I have
Hi,
a question. Gary. Hi. When you do this kind of a vote where you're voting for multiple people, will it generally tend to encourage more candidates? And I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but I'm just wondering if it seems like it would encourage more candidates for an office. Is that true or not?
What you hear argued is that all better voting methods encourage more candidates because the establishment candidate, the front runner candidate won't be afraid of a spoiler. So that, sometimes you hear, you shouldn't run. You're just going to take votes away from this other good candidate. You don't hear that so much with these better voting methods because the voter can express support for more than one candidate. So all of these methods, I think, encourage more candidates to run. And there was a great video in Fargo, North Dakota, about approval voting, and they had all the candidates saying, or vote for all of us, in a little Zoom screen with all the candidates saying it at the same time. It was great.
So we think that would be a good thing to have more candidates.
It's a great thing if you have a better voting method. If you don't have a good voting method, then having more candidates makes it harder for somebody to choose their one person that they're going to vote for.
Right. Yeah.
So, some people say, oh, we should encourage more candidates to run. And I think, but we also need to have a better voting method. I think those two need to go hand in. If you want political party support or you want establishment support, I think those two should probably go hand in hand. But yeah, I mean,
all right.
More choice is always better, and being able to express your choice is even better than that. Thanks for the question.
Okay,
Anybody else? Okay. So what are benefits to voters from adopting a better voting method? Here's your bullet point right here, Gary. More candidates may be encouraged to run, giving you more choices. And it will reduce or eliminate the vote splitting so that two popular candidates with plurality voting, two popular candidates can split the vote and the least popular person can win. But if you have a better voting method, that vote splitting is dealt with in a much better way, usually eliminated, and you end up with a candidate that's a winner that's more acceptable. Okay, in a multi-winner voting method in the primary, you can get a better candidate pool in the general election. So right now, if you have partisan primary, it may be that the primary is where your vote matters. And if you're in a heavy Democratic jurisdiction, you want to vote in that Democratic primary so you have a voice, because it doesn't matter who the Republicans pick, the Democratic candidate is going to end up winning. So what they've done in California is they have the top, everybody runs against everybody else in the primary. So it's not a partisan primary, it's what's called a blanket primary. Everybody runs against everybody. And then the top two winners end up going on to the general election. And often it's two people of the same party. If it's a congressional district that's heavy Democratic, then the two Democrats end up in the general. And same thing if it's a heavy Republican area, two Republicans end up in the general election. And that's probably a better system. So this multi-winner primary means you don't have a Democratic primary with one winner and a Republican primary with one winner. You have multiple winners, usually two. In Alaska, they had 4-winner primary. One of the problems with that is that the voters may be confused. And I heard that in the primary in Alaska, sometimes people thought they were supposed to vote for 4 people. And they were only supposed to vote for 1, but the top 4 went on to the general election. And because the primaries are so important, I mean, maybe we should be using a better voting method in the primary. So
Celeste, could I make a comment about that?
yeah.
I've forgotten now exactly what election it was, but the other thing about the blanket primaries that California uses, and I think Washington State has some elections that use those. And I remember looking at an election in Washington where the Democrats got the most votes, but they ran too many candidates, and the Democratic votes, again, because it's a choose one, the Democratic votes were split among 3 or 4 candidates, and the Republicans ran 2 candidates. And so even though there were more total votes for Democrats than for Republicans, the general election ended up being between 2 Republicans. So I think there's a lot to like about blanket primaries, but not with a choose one voting method. You definitely need a more expressive voting method to get the 2 candidates with the broadest consensus into the general election there.
Thanks, Jen. So there are more benefits to voters from adopting a better voting method. Your vote is less likely to be what we call wasted. That means not make a difference, especially in a proportional representation election where you're electing multiple people to a body like a city council or maybe a state legislature. In a proportional representation election, almost every single person gets some representation in the final elected body. So we have talked about that. We will continue to talk about PR elections. And then finally, candidates are more likely to engage in positive campaigning since voters can weigh in on all the candidates. There was a Maine video of 2 people running for governor who campaigned together in a television ad. And I already mentioned the Fargo election where there were 2 people being elected, but they all were in one campaign ad talking about approval voting and saying nice things about each other. So in terms of the impact on candidates, you might actually have to work harder as a candidate because you may have competition. People will feel like the bar to entry is lower. It's easier to go ahead and run and get some exposure. And even if you don't win, it might, this is a way to get your name out there and win in the end. And then there are always various George Santos or other controversial things that happen, and then somebody can fill the void if the front runner runs into a problem. So I think it's good for democracy to have a lot of people interested in running. And I think the league probably agrees with that. So in proportional representation, you can get elected if a sizable minority strongly supports you. It doesn't have to be a majority, but you look at Colorado, and most of the counties are majority Republican or plurality Republican, and they elect all of the county commissioners. But perhaps it would be good for democracy if every county commission had some Democrats and some Republicans. So that you had voices from both parties. And that's not what we're getting right now in the counties. I mentioned to Gary that there's less pressure to clear the field of candidates. So that means that long shot candidates can jump into the race and introduce themselves to the electorate. A great thing about some of these better voting methods is that candidates can see what their true support is in the electorate. So for instance, with approval voting, you can vote for more than one candidate. So it means that, 50% of the people might support me and 60% might support another candidate, and the winner might get 70% of the vote. But it tells you that even the candidates that lost were acceptable candidates, had a lot of support. And that's not true in plurality. You are only allowed to choose one, and you don't have any idea whether voters also supported somebody else but thought they had no chance. And instant runoff voting has some difficulty with this too, because it's basically also choose one at a time. You only see one choice at a time. And so you don't know who the backup choices are a lot of the times. And you don't see, you also don't know how far behind the first choice the backup choices are. Whereas in STAR, which is score voting from 0 to 5, if somebody scores one candidate a 5 and another candidate a 4, that 4 candidate is right behind the 5 candidate. They have a lot of, the voter has a lot of support for that candidate they gave a 4 to. So candidates, I think, should like approval and STAR voting a lot. And IRV, the ranked choice voting single winner version, also has some advantage for candidates because it gets rid of the vote splitting effect. And then candidates will have to, or will be strongly self-encouraged to reach out to every voter with a positive message, and to reach out to voters who support other candidates. So this does mean that it might be a possibly more expensive campaign, but if you are electing something like a city council or a legislature and you're using proportional representation, it doesn't have to be a more expensive campaign, because you can reach out to your strong supporters. And if you have a large enough minority of people, you will get a seat on that election, on that board. So this is like getting a little into the weeds. Does anybody have any questions about candidates? There are good and bad things here, maybe, for candidates. But you definitely have to have candidates on board when you're thinking about adopting a new voting method. So let's look at the election administrators' experience. I'd say it's even more important to have the election administrators on board. They have a lot of sway in Colorado, especially for any big cities. All of the voting methods, non-plurality voting methods that we've used so far in Colorado have been in Aspen, in Telluride, and Basalt. And the town administrators ran the election. They did not have the county clerks run the election, and that's not gonna fly for the bigger cities. The bigger cities don't want to run the election. They want the county clerks to run it. So we got to get the election administrators on board for the bigger cities. So thinking about ballots, the order of ballot contests in Colorado is set by law. And they're discovering right now in Boulder and in Broomfield that sticking a ranked voting contest in the middle of plurality contests is tricky. It's a different size, it has columns, and there's some talk about moving the having two ballot sheets, one for the plurality contests and one for the others. And this is what I was talking about earlier in the Secretary of State rulemaking hearing. This is something where maybe we could help. We could, as the league suggests, that that the statutory revision committee maybe change the law or ask a lawmaker to carry a bill to allow the order of ballot contest to be more flexible when you have a better voting method in addition to plurality contests on the ballot. So, and that because RCV and star contests take up more room, the number of ballot sheets may increase. That drives up printing and postage. So that's another thing to think about. In terms of staff training, there's a one-time cost for creating new materials to figure out how to adjudicate the ballots, to audit the contest, to conduct manual recounts. Approval voting, once again, is very simple. Approval voting so simple, you'd think, why doesn't everybody just adopt approval voting? And I think that first of all, approval voting doesn't have a big lobby behind it, a lot of money behind it. It has some money, but another thing is that I think people like to say more than just thumbs up and thumbs down. They like to actually differentiate a little bit more between the candidates. In terms of staff training, added costs for periodic training on these better voting methods would be part of the cost of the staff training costs. Anything people want to say about election administrators? We also have had Dwight Shellman. He attended our group last month, and he works for the Secretary of State and helps the election administrators run their elections. So he could add a lot more about this but he's been on vacation. So, okay, I'm going to move on. Voter education is a big part of election administrators' experience. I know that Dwight is working with Boulder and Broomfield, and they want to have a consistent message. They do not want any outside group like RCV for Colorado trying to spread a message that is different from the message that the county clerks are spreading. So this is an important thing to consider. One thing is, how often are you having these elections? So Boulder and Broomfield are going to have these IRV elections every 2 years. That's what Cambridge does. Minneapolis uses ranked voting only every 4 years. So they have a steeper learning curve because they have to do it every 4 years. In terms of conducting the election, it's important that you make sure the tabulation algorithm actually works. New York City in 2021, when they ran the results for the first batch, they included a bunch of test ballots and they reported the wrong results. So there need to be procedures in place to make sure that doesn't happen. In Oakland in 2022, there was a problem where they did not count the write-in votes. And because of that, for this instant runoff Oakland School Board District 4 election, they got the wrong winner. And there was a lawsuit. The person who was declared the winner incorrectly was sworn in and seated, but resigned from the board last month. So it was the talk of the Bay Area for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, I don't know. So you definitely want it. And Colorado is very good about running elections carefully. So I guess I'm not too worried about Colorado, but there's no reason we should repeat a mistake somebody else has done. More about election administrators. They have a lot of work to do. In terms of reporting results, you should aim for a meaningful display of the election results. For approval voting, you should report it as a % of ballots. Remember, I said that suppose I got 50% of the vote and another candidate got 60% and the winner got 70%, you still want to report it as a % of ballots or a % of voters. You don't want to say that the winner got 30% of the votes. That's not very meaningful. You want to talk about what support the person got. And we also want to do this for multi-winner plurality elections, I believe. Certainly the Boulder County League is working on this. And then there are better and worse visual and numerical displays of round by round results for RCV, different forms of RCV, and for star voting. So we want to make sure that different ones are considered and the best one is used for reporting the results. We also need to lower the public's expectations of getting much in terms of preliminary results on election night for any of the ranked voting methods, and maybe for star voting and probably for multi-county contests. So I know Alaska, I think they weren't announcing any results except the first round results on election night because they had military ballots that they could accept up to a week late or so. And Maine also, for their instant runoff voting elections, they said expect to wait 2 weeks. So they were doing a good job of lowering public expectations. In terms of post-election audits, Colorado doesn't do risk limiting audits on instant runoff voting, so we'll have to do a more traditional audit, at least at first. There are efforts to come up with a way to do risk limiting audits on IRV. The risk limiting audits for approval voting are the same as for plurality voting. Any questions on election administrators? Let's all give election administrators a hand because they do so much work. Okay, let's consider jurisdictions experiences. So if you need special software, which you do for instant runoff voting, Broomfield and Boulder are going to pay a licensing fee. They'll split the cost. And I guess if Boulder doesn't end up having 3 people running for mayor, then they won't have to pay that fee. I'm not sure. I expect Broomfield's going to have like 5 elections or 6 elections. So they will probably have to use the software for at least one of those offices. Right now, we only have a bill that requires county clerks to run instant runoff voting elections for municipalities. If we go to counties or school boards or special districts, having county clerks coordinate elections, then the costs would need to be figured out, and that would probably require some enabling legislation. I was disappointed in Boulder the city just passed a charter amendment limiting the number of people who can run for mayor. And this is right when Boulder is starting to use IRV, which would reduce the spoiler effect. So I feel like this is not taking advantage of IRV. Any comments on jurisdictions or election administrators or voters or candidates?
Celeste, I just have a question. I didn't know about this charter amendment. What's the limit?
It says that right now, if you want to run for city council, you can, and then if you get elected, you can run for mayor. They're saying you can't run for city council and mayor at the same election cycle.
Oh, I
You
see.
have
But,
to choose.
but it's not like, I see. You made it sound like only 10 people can run for mayor or something, but.
Lots of people can run for mayor, but the problem is only one can win. So you might have 9 great people who lose, and they can't then be on city council, which they could right now. So I feel like it's a bad thing. It's simpler, but I think it's bad. So let's think about what we've learned. We only have experience with towns using ranked voting so far, and the town clerk did the counting, but we're going to learn more this fall. Approval voting is the simplest to implement, but voters may want to be able to say more than just thumbs up and thumbs down. IRV has added costs and training. STAR appears simpler to implement than IRV because STAR uses summation and score comparison rather than transfers. The problem with transferring votes is that the ballot changes. You used to have your vote count for your first choice. Now your vote counts for your second choice. So you have to somehow, your ballot has to note that it's changed. The vote is no longer for the first choice. Now it's for the second choice. Whereas the STAR ballot always looks the same. It does. So that makes STAR easier. Dwight from the Secretary of State's office might disagree because we haven't used STAR. And so he doesn't want to make a call on that, but I guess that's the call that seems correct because the ballot value doesn't change. And using a better voting method means that voters should have a more positive experience and feel like more of their voice is heard. Here's a fun cartoon that is a bit complicated, but I'll just leave it up here for a minute and you can look at it and ask questions if you want. Board account is a type of ranked voting also, like instant runoff and single transferable vote. I think transferable is misspelled, right, Jen?
I'm not actually sure if it's got 1 or 2 R's.
Okay, that's all I had. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I don't know if anybody has questions or comments they want to make. Welcome, Barb. I saw you join the group. Jen is going to do the next presentation.
Yes, I am. If I can find the right window, which is always fun. There we go. All right. So can everybody see this ballot?
Yes.
Okay. So as Celeste mentioned, Alaska, actually, they did this twice because Congressman Don Young died while in office. So they had a special election in August to replace Congressman Young, and then a regular election in November for a full term. And so the examples I'm going to show you are from the special election because that's the one I've looked at the most. So this is what the ranked choice ballot looked like. There were 3 candidates, Nick Begich, Sarah Palin, and Mary Peltola, and there was also an option to write in a candidate. So that made for 4 total choices. And for each one of these, you could rank who was your first, second, third, or fourth place candidate. And so what I'm going to show you, this is based on an analysis of the cast ballot record, which is more than what was publicly reported. But the public reporting indicated just a certain percentage of ballots. It was around 2% of ballots were invalid in some way or another, but it didn't say much more than that about that. But the cast ballot record was eventually, after some time, made public, so that with the right software, you could look and actually see, at least among the ballots that were cast electronically, which was most of them, there were just a handful of manually cast ballots. So you could actually see how voters voted, and this included the invalid ballots. So you could see things that voters did, either whether they were just being ornery or whether they failed to understand the instructions. And there's basically two ways that you can invalidate a ranked choice ballot. The first one is by overvoting, giving the same ranking to multiple candidates. So if you had two candidates that you really liked and you decided, I'm going to give them both a first place ranking, that's an invalid ballot, and that ballot was not counted. The other thing that you can do is skip rankings. You know, maybe you say, I don't like any of these guys a lot, but I'm going to give this candidate a 3rd place ranking and this candidate a 4th place ranking. The rules as they were interpreted in this particular election was that 2 consecutive skipped rankings would result in an invalid ballot. So this is actually a little strange. You could skip first choice and give a candidate a 2nd choice ranking, and that would count. But if you skipped first and second and gave your highest ranking as 3rd choice, that would not count. So that's already kind of complicated. This is from the Alaska Board of Elections webpage, all the rules about how they would be counted and various settings that they could set in the Dominion voting software for how to count. And this isn't particularly important. So I just wanted to show you some examples of some of the ways people voted. So in each of these slides, each row is one particular ballot, and this is the number of times this particular ballot occurred in the cast vote record of about 188,000 total votes. So there were voters who only voted for Begich and only gave Begich a 3rd place ranking. That was the only thing they indicated. 62 voters did that. 127 did the same thing for Palin, and 96 voters did the same thing for Peltola. Does this setup of this table make sense? Please stop me and ask questions if I'm not being clear.
Can you say what you think these voters might have been thinking when they voted this way?
You know, I can imagine that they thought, well, if I have to vote for somebody, it's one. I think these are probably, I don't know, who knows, right? My speculation is these were voters who don't like any of them. But if they say, if I have to pick somebody, I'll pick this one, but I want to let you know that I don't like them very much. I think some of these voters may have confused the rankings for scorings, right? So maybe I just want to give this candidate a score, but not a very good score.
So Jen, were these then invalid ballots? Is that what you were
Yes.
saying? Because they skipped 2?
That's correct.
Okay.
So this is a couple of hundred voters here who, whatever they meant, they didn't have their votes counted.
And if you go back to the first slide, it says on that, it says first choice right there above it. So, I mean, right above where you mark it, it says first choice and 2nd choice and 3rd choice and 4th choice. So that's another, you know, it's hard to make a foolproof ballot, but, you know, they're getting better and better at making ballots, but maybe it'll never be possible to make a foolproof one.
Well, I mean, how many of you read all the terms and conditions on websites before you click agree? I mean, you present voters with a big paragraph of instructions, and quite a lot of them are not going to read it at all because it's like, it's too much trouble. I know what I'm doing. So, you know, advocates for IRV tend to say, oh, this is very simple. You just rank your first choice and then your 2nd choice and blah, blah, blah. And so what I want to show you here is that, okay, maybe for most voters, this is simple, but there is a non-trivial percentage of voters who for whatever reason, they don't understand the instructions, they don't do them correctly. And it's not a big percentage, it's 1 or 2%, but we can all rattle off plenty of elections where 1 or 2% was enough to swing the election. So it matters if there's 1 or 2% of voters who are not understanding how to vote correctly.
So Jen, you said that on an electronic ballot, you said these were all recorded electronically or something, but it wasn't that the voters filled them in electronically, because if you are filling this in on a machine, it will
Right.
prevent you from.
Right. It's a little bit hard to parse what the website said about this. So most voters filled out their ballots on paper and then the machine scanned them and recorded them. There were a small number of ballots that apparently were cast and processed manually. And I mean, a very small number, like not enough to change much. But the reported total number of ballots does not match the number in the cast ballot record because it includes some that were cast manually and counted manually, not counted by the machine. So for me, as just a lay member of the public, it's very hard to, even with the cast ballot record, it's very hard for me to confirm that I know what happened in this election because of those manually counted ballots that are not included in this record.
And Jen, weren't there some write-ins also that maybe got 3s, but you're just not worrying about the write-ins at all because they were so few?
So, well, no, so in these particular ones, these are who also did not have a write-in candidate. So it was valid to say, write in somebody for your first choice, skip second choice, and then vote for one of these 3 candidates as third choice. That's actually a valid ballot. But this particular sample that I'm showing you, these are people who also did not have a write-in candidate. And I have a few more slides with some sample wonky things people did, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands what this table is intended to mean. This is not a long talk. I just have a few more slides. Okay, so here are some others who voted for 2 candidates, but didn't give anybody their first or second choice. They voted for one candidate third and another one fourth, and they also didn't have a write-in candidate for these particular ballots. Interestingly enough, this happened a lot more often for candidates ranking Palin and Begich than for candidates ranking Peltola and one of the, it should also be said, Begich and Palin were both Republicans and Peltola was a Democrat. So here were some overvotes. So there were 5 voters who gave Begich and Peltola both first place and Palin second place. There were 17 votes who gave Begich and Peltola both first place and then gave Palin fourth place. And then there were 5 votes who had Begich and Peltola tied for second, but no other rankings listed. There were all possible permutations of saying everybody's tied, giving all 3 candidates the same ranking. So there were 16 ballots that gave everybody a first place vote. There were 4 that gave everybody a second place vote, 3 that gave everybody third place, and 15 that gave everybody fourth place. Okay, and I think that's the last slide. This is, by the way, not at all a complete list of the funny ways people voted. I think when I, went through and had a computer program count the number of different ways people voted, there were something like 300 different ways that people filled out ballots, and I think 24 of them were valid or something like that. So people filled out their ballots in a lot of really wonky ways in this election. Interestingly, so this was the special election. There was this, you almost might consider it a do-over because it was the same 3 candidates plus 1 additional candidate who did not have much support in the November election. And the percentage of invalid ballots in the November election was only about half as much as it was in the August election. So perhaps there was better education and voters understood better what to do by November. So
it was half as much percentage wise or half as much?
I think so. I think it was half as much percentage wise.
Yeah.
it's hard to draw big conclusions, right? Because the general election electorate is definitely going to be different than the special election electorate. So, without a lot more information than what's available, it's hard to know how the different electorate changes things. It did not change the outcome. In both cases, Mary Peltola won both elections, but not with 50% of the vote initially. They did both have to go to the second round. Palin was eliminated in both elections. And so, no, Begich, sorry, it's late. Begich was eliminated in both elections, and Begich's votes were then split between Palin and Peltola. Interestingly, voters who voted for Palin or Peltola first did not get to have their second place votes counted. And those voters overwhelmingly, both Palin and Peltola voters overwhelmingly ranked Begich second. To the extent that if you just looked at every ballot, like in the second stage of a star ballot, and you just looked at these two, for every pair of candidates who would win head to head, Begich would have won head to head contest against either Palin or Peltola in this election. And yet he was the first one eliminated in IRV because he had broad support as a second choice candidate, but not enough support as a first choice candidate to make it to the second round.
So what Jen is saying is that if fewer people had showed up to vote for Palin, she would have been eliminated, and then it would have been Begich versus Peltola in the runoff, and Begich would have won.
Right.
So a lot of Republicans are quite unhappy with this result. Democrats are got their person elected, so they're happier, but this has been a big topic of discussion in the voting methods world. And when you look at the comments for the Secretary of State's rulemaking hearing on the instant runoff voting rules, there are a number of people who just sent in a comment, a paragraph long, that said, this is a terrible voting method, let's just get rid of it entirely, instead of addressing how the best way to implement it. And I think it's partly a result, and some of them mentioned Alaska in particular. So
yeah.
Does anybody else have questions, or should we stop sharing the screen? Okay. So I'll go back to moving forward. What do we want to do moving forward? Can you see my screen? About revisit discussion of possible goals. Okay, we had been interested in trying to get better voting methods implemented at the state and federal election level. In particular, some of the things we said were better single winner voting methods for all statewide offices, proportional voting method for the state legislature, and better presidential primaries that give voters more voice. So do people have comments about these goals in light of what we've talked about on how elections actually work in Colorado? We are the State League Alternative Voting Methods Task Force, so our thinking was we should look at state and federal elections.
So I'll just comment. So as Celeste mentioned, one of the things that the Boulder League is considering is a study on primary elections, which would include, the possibility of better voting elections for primaries. And I think as we've been talking about this amongst those of us who've been talking about it, we're coming to realize that you need to talk about primaries when you talk about implementing these sort of voting methods. And if that study is approved, we will definitely, want input and help beyond just our Boulder League on that. So I kind of just want to put a bug in the ear of everybody here that if the Boulder League actually ends up conducting that study, we hope to get input from you all and from leagues around the state on that too.
2 points of clarification. It's a Boulder County League. It's not just the city of Boulder. So
Right.
we used to be the Boulder Valley League, which matched the school board district, whatever, but now we're the Boulder County League. And then the second thing, full disclosure, Jen is one of the leaders of this primary study. So she's
Assuming it happens.
assuming it happens. So she's a great person to work with, I can say from experience. Any other comments about these possible goals? They're certainly big goals, and they will require some work and lots of steps. And I don't know if we have the bandwidth to do it, but I'm just throwing these out there because this is what we've talked about.
I have a question.
Yes, Jeff.
On the second bullet down on the top there, proportional vote. I don't pretend to understand all of these different methods that well, or at all actually. So I may be confused, but proportional voting method for state legislature, would that mean you'd have to combine House districts as we know them now? And so there would be multiple candidates in each House district.
Multiple winners. You'd have like
Or
a
multiple,
super,
and both, yeah, right. That's right.
yeah, you'd have to have like a super House district, and you'd elect 5 people from that House district,
So
something like that.
there'd be a regional election. And
Well, there already is regional elections for some state legislature seats, right?
So one way to think of it is that, so we have 65 seats in the House and 35 seats in the Senate. And until last year, we had 7 congressional districts. So if we had 5-member districts, each Senate district would be the same size as one of our old congressional districts. And each House district would be about half that.
yeah, we have 8 now, I think.
Yeah.
So that would be a radical change to the system. It's not just a different way of choosing multiple people off of a ballot in the jurisdictions we know now, but it would also be reapportioning the whole state into different voting districts, I guess, eh?
You're right. It would be a very big change. The argument for it is that right now, there are a lot of people who never feel like they have any representation in the state legislature. If you're a Republican in Denver, you're never going to have somebody, your representative is never going to represent your views. And if you're a Democrat, in the rural Western Slope, same thing.
Yeah.
But if we had 5-member districts, even as democratic as Denver is, it would probably elect 4 Democrats and 1 Republican. So, and possibly even someone from the Green Party or the Libertarian Party. It would take about 16% support to get one of those 5 seats. I guess about 17%. So it's conceivable that, as we were saying, the advantage of proportional representation is that sizable minorities can get a seat at the table and can have their views represented.
That's a much heavier lift, though, isn't it? I mean, to convince people that they I don't know. It seems like that's biting off a lot. So maybe, and that's before most people have in the state have had any experience with any alternative system.
Yeah, you're right. This is a big dream.
Okay.
So Jeff, when I talked to the Erie Charter Commission as an individual, not as a league member, I pointed out that proportional voting could happen for Erie starting in 2025, which is when their first elections would be, because the state legislature already has instant runoff voting software they're planning on buying and licensing. And the software has a little toggle switch that lets you use the proportional RCV method. So it shouldn't be very hard to get it. It's all a step at a time. And yes, it's a heavy lift, but if we can get it in local cities first, like the Boulder County League is suggesting that that the charter committee for the city of Boulder look into proportional representation. And there's one person on the city council who says he's a strong supporter, but we should wait till next year to deal with it. So yes, it's a big lift. Yes, no doubt about it. There is a movement nationwide. And one of the things that we could do is we could ask for the Fair Representation Act. We could support that and ask our members of Congress to become co-sponsors of it. So Joe Neguse, for instance, is a co-sponsor of the U.S. Fair Representation Act. I'm not sure it's been introduced yet in this legislative session. But it was in the last congressional session, in the one before that, and the one before that. So it's been, it's out there. And yeah, so next steps, one of them is educating and connecting with stakeholders. Like the Boulder County League is talking about meeting with lots of local groups and talking to them about what proportional representation is. We're talking about having a community conversation connecting DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, with PR, proportional representation. Yeah, there's a lot going on. Under connecting with stakeholders, I mentioned earlier, we could propose a bill to allow separate ballot sheets for contests using different voting methods. We should have community conversations of what voting method to pursue in each community. Do we want this to be a bill or a ballot measure? Ballot measures are, if you're collecting signatures, it's expensive and a lot of work. If you're getting the it as referred from the legislature, it's less work, but it's as much work as a bill. Plus, you have to have the campaign afterwards. So yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah.
Any
Hey,
other
Celeste,
comments? Yeah.
Approval voting has been used in certain cities, right?
It's been used in St. Louis, Missouri, and in the primary, and the top two winners have gone on to the general, and it's been a nonpartisan, it's been a blanket primary. And then in Fargo, they use it for their municipal elections also.
Has there ever been an analysis done like we were just presented of how that approval voting worked out, and did in fact, strategies come into play where people voted special ways just to get the election to go the way they wanted?
One of the things that the RCV for Colorado, I guess, did some sort of study, although I don't think they're sharing their data publicly, in which they said a lot of the voters bullet voted, meaning they only voted for one, even though they could have voted for more than one. But if you only like one, if you only support one candidate, you're totally allowed to do that. The question is, do some voters take advantage of the ability to vote for more than one? And yes, some voters do. So that's been, so I would call it a success in Fargo, particularly for the single winner offices. And I would call it a success in St. Louis for the primary.
It should be also noted that the North Dakota legislature just overturned RCV and approval voting, including in Fargo.
That did actually happen?
Yep.
Has it been signed by the governor?
I don't know, but I'll be shocked if it's not.
So does that mean that Fargo won't be able to use approval voting anymore?
Assuming it survives whatever court challenges may or may not be brought, yeah. I guess
So
this is specifically about, killing it in Fargo.
So one of the things that we're struggling with is, there are different groups out there pushing their particular voting method, and they say bad things about other voting methods, and you kind of have like a little civil war in the voting method world, and we should all be working together instead of fighting against each other, so that we can get better voting methods out there. And maybe if one community tries one, another community will try another one. But instead, what's happening is North Dakota is banning both approval and RCV. And that's not what we want.
One of the problems with getting any better voting method adopted is that, especially if it requires agreement by whoever is currently in power, well, they got elected with the voting method currently in place, so they have incentive to not want to change it, whatever it is.
It's past 8 o'clock, so I would like to talk about the additional topics we might want to explore, or suggesting, let's talk about the next meeting date. I'm suggesting April 17th, 6:30. Any comments, any opposition?
I will not be able to attend, but go ahead without me.
We would certainly miss you, Brenda.
Right, who's going to do the introductions?
Nobody will do them as well as you, but okay. I'm going to go back to the previous slide, and so one thing we could talk about next month is better ways to report election results, which is sort of an interesting topic. I'm also interested in inviting some out-of-state speakers to talk about cumulative voting, which I met a league member from Amarillo, Texas, who's very gung-ho about that, and it's very easy to implement. I'd love to have somebody from Utah talk about preferential block voting. We have some contacts in the Maine League, and we could talk about their experience with ranked voting. We don't have to have a speaker. We could just talk about what we want to do next. I kind of like having a speaker myself. Does anybody have a preference for any of these, or do we want to have somebody say, this is what we should do going forward, and this is why? Anybody want to get on a podium and talk about? Yes, Maude.
Do we think the Maine League was involved in their change to getting ranked voting?
They were involved, but a lot has happened since then. Like, the state constitution does not let you use ranked voting for their statewide state general offices, general election offices. So when you ran for governor, the primary used instant runoff voting, but the general election did not. And their constitution is similar to the Colorado Constitution. So there may be a problem with using instant runoff voting in Colorado for, say, governor. We could probably do it in the primary, but whether, or maybe we couldn't, I don't know. I mean, we have different constitutions, but they have some similar language. Is that who you'd be interested in hearing from, is Maine?
Oh, I thought it would be interesting to hear not only what their experience is, but how they got it implemented. Whoever
I know
speaks.
I know that they had it in Portland first, and they used instant runoff voting, and then they had a multi-winner election for a charter commission, and they weren't set up to use proportional RCV, so they used a mutant form of instant runoff voting to elect multiple winners. And that's actually what Utah uses right now, this preferential block voting. And so they just in this 2022, they had a big campaign and they got the voters to accept to change it to proportional RCV. So talking about a big lift, Jeff, this is, they did it. And so anybody have, we could invite all these people and see who's available to come. I also think it would be great if somebody said, this is what I want our task force to work on, and here are the steps to make it happen. Because if we want to be action oriented, we got to start thinking about the action.
I'd like to see some kind of discussion of St. Louis and Fargo, maybe at the next meeting. I think we need to either get behind those or kick them out.
Okay, I'm going to add that to the list. The league was very involved in Fargo, and I might be able to get Kathleen, last name Farnell, something to come and speak, or another person that we worked with. I don't know what to do about Jed Limke is the guy in Fargo, and we could ask him. It'd be interesting to, I feel like I should contact him just after this North Dakota ruling, this North Dakota bill. So yeah, okay. I'm happy to reach out to them. Brenda.
Well, I'm just wondering if we're kind of getting bogged down in which method. Well, I mean, we've kind of concluded that there's no perfect method. And should we start looking at how to start educating the public just on better methods in general, so that we can, what do I want to say, so that the public even has a clue what's going on? I mean, if we spend all of our time trying to figure out the best method and who, you know, who's got this method, that method, and we're not educating the public, we're just kind of in a little echo chamber here. So I guess I'm saying, I'd like to see us start talking about how we're going to educate the public.
I would agree with that, because, you know, one of the things that's come up is, you know, to get anything enacted would need broad public support, and we don't know what the public will support until we start teaching them about the alternatives.
Yeah,
So-
the skewed elections has been going on since, well, 1992 in my experience. And yet here we are still talking about, well, we're just going to have 2 candidates on the ballot. And I think that's a good point. I think we do need some broader education in the electorate.
I'm curious how we would approach teaching the public about these different methods if we don't have one that we're championing, because they are very different. And I think it could get very confusing if you show them this plethora of options and say, look, there's so many better options you could be using. And then it would be really hard to know really what you're talking about and differentiate between them and what ultimately is going to happen, wouldn't it?
Maybe this is a reason to invite the folks from approval from St. Louis and Fargo who have done this successfully and get their take on what worked.
I love
There's
that. Maine too.
Yeah, Maine also.
There's a great panel discussion, I thought, that Fargo did when they were running their campaign for Prop D for democracy. Great name, Prop D, to adopt approval voting for the blanket primary. And they talked a little bit about how the whole voter education process happened. And they came in a little bit after the whole thing started, but so I'll invite Kathleen Farrell to see if she can join us on April 17th. I agree with you, Carrie, that it is problematic. People get confused when there are multiple methods presented, and it's an advantage that each of these individual groups has because they can just focus on their one method. Don't know what to do about that if we want to educate people just on the general idea of better voting methods. We can talk about how terrible plurality is. That's easy.
But I think like was mentioned before, we can listen to these other experiences and see what we can learn from it. And I guess we could also try some, some outreach and do our best shot at teaching about these different methods and see how it works. Perhaps I'm being overly pessimistic,
I think it's all a learning experience. So yes, it's definitely easier to try to sell one, but I like that the league is open and into research. Okay, so
Just one more, I guess, just a comment on there though, and I'm basing this on kind of the conversations that happened in meetings several meetings ago. Is this group going to even agree on which method is the best method?
I personally don't believe there is a single best method for all situations, so I'm going to go with no.
Jen can't agree among herself, so I mean, I think that in terms of single winner elections, there's one that's easiest to implement, right? But maybe that's not going to swing it for voters. It's yeah. And voters have many, many, many things to think about besides voting methods. So is this a big enough issue for the voters is always a question. Or do we, who gets to decide the voting method? And you have to get the endorsements because a lot of people aren't paying attention. If it's a vote of the people, you have to get a momentum going. So why don't I see if Kathleen Farrell will talk on next month. And then we should think about how to educate people on better voting methods. Like maybe we could have some questions. I know you won't be here, Brenda, but maybe you could if you have some ideas, questions, or comments, you could send them to us. Does that sound good, everybody? Betty,
Yes, ma'am.
I hope you tell us how your event goes, and if you want some help, let us know.
Yeah, I feel like we really haven't been involved in this long enough. I feel like I'm sorry I haven't had any input into this, but I sort of still feel behind on the whole subject. And
So Pat has given a talk to the Gunnison League on single winner voting methods and mentioned proportional representation. Pat's on this call. And Pat's going to do this again April 13th.
13.
For the San Luis Valley League. When is your event? Because you could tune into the San Luis Valley League, or you could listen to the recording of the Gunnison League. And
we're doing it from April 10th through the 14th.
Okay.
And we're just going to cover basically plurality, approval, score, rank, RCV or IRV or whatever, and star voting, those methods. Just basically at this point, we're not going to touch on proportional representation. I feel like that's probably another subject, and and not the time to bring it up at this point.
You
And
know, Betty, on our webpage, the Boulder County League webpage, there is a presentation that's on there, a canned presentation. You're allowed to use it. It's, we came up with a voter called Vicky Voter. And we
yes,
go through each one of the methods and
yes, we're
show how
using that. We're going to use that in our presentation for the units. That's our basic presentation. And then we found in the Minnesota, back from 2004, they have a whole series of neat discussion questions that are really, do we really want to change voting methods? Is it worth the trouble? Is this better value-wise than the other, for discussion? So that's basically was what our unit meeting is going to be. It's going to be the Boulder presentation on those, just on those basic methods, and then just some good discussion questions for people to talk about it and see where we go from there.
Betty, would you send us the Minnesota information?
Oh, okay, I'll try to. I always have problems getting it, finding the right link for it, but yes, they're excellent.
That would be great. I would love to see it because I like their videos, their both their IRV and they call it IRV 2.0 or something like that, but it's really the proportional RCV. They do great sticky note videos.
Ah, okay, I will send that to you.
Thank you so much.
I think I have your contact.
I sent out the email for this meeting, so you probably do.
Yeah.
So, okay. Does that all sound good thanks for coming to the meeting. Thanks,
Thank you
Jen,
for
for
having me.
Thank you.
doing your presentation. Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
sure.